Hello, duelists, and welcome back to Master Duel Academy. I am your professor for this session, Professor Lex, and today we'll be covering a topic that I see very often highly requested, not only in my comment section, but also just in general in a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Discussion spaces. And that is the question of, when exactly do I use disruption against my opponent? It can be a very daunting prospect, right? Utilizing all this disruption that we have at our disposal, like Maxi, Ash Blossom, Imperm, just to name a few, against all of these different decks, especially because all of these different decks have a lot of different instances in which they want these cards to be used. It's not like you can necessarily use Ash Blossom at the same point against every single deck, because, well, obviously every deck plays very differently and has very different strategies that they're trying to achieve, and it can be a little bit confusing and a little bit daunting to try to learn it all. So I've done videos like this in the past, but I like to kind of like, I guess, remake this style of video every so often, just to make sure that we're keeping up with the metagame and addressing all the relevant decks. So here's how this video is going to work. We're going to be talking about mainly 3 points of disruption that tend to appear in pretty much every single deck in Master Duel. That's going to be Maxi, Ash Blossom, and Infinite Permanence. We'll not only talk about how to use these cards generally, but we'll also go through some of the most popular decks in the format. I think we got like 7 or 8 of them lined up, and we'll talk about how to not just utilize these 3 cards against these decks, but also disruption in general. We will, however, again have a primary focus on Maxi, Ash Blossom, and Infinite Permanence, because again, these are the most universally used and generally applicable disruption cards that can fit into pretty much every single deck, like 98% of decks on Master Duel. So yeah, let's just go ahead and get straight into it. Again, we'll start with general tips and then move on to some more specific deck discussion. Alright, so right off the bat, we're going to start by talking about everybody's favorite level 2 Earth insect. That's going to be Maxi. Now, you might be thinking that Maxi is a card that seems very straightforward to play, right? You just play it and then you win. However, it can be a bit more complex and nuanced than that at sometimes. Particularly when it comes to at the timing you want to use Maxi. You can either use it when your opponent starts to make plays during their main phase or during their draw phase. The reason to play Maxi during the draw phase is to play around the card Triple Tactics Talent. And often I like to play Maxi during the draw phase specifically because of this card. As of the latest meta report, I believe about 30% of decks in Master Duel play Triple Tactics Talent, and if you resolve Maxi during the draw phase, you know, you not only avoid playing around that card, but you are still getting the main benefit of Maxi, and that's discouraging your opponent from playing out their hand. However, there are some instances where I would wait to use the Maxi, particularly if my hand is just generally not looking that good. If I need a draw off the top of my deck just to have plays on the next turn, then I would not play Maxi in the draw phase to play around Triple Tack, because then the more pressing matter is just making sure that I have cards to play for my turn coming up. So in that instance, I would definitely wait until your opponent is summoning cards to play Maxi. Basically, it just depends on how good your hand is, right? If your hand's already good, I would throw out Maxi during the draw phase. If it's not, I would definitely wait until you're able to get guaranteed draws to potentially make your hand a little bit better. It might seem like it might not matter much, but it is a very nuanced thing that can come up quite a bit. So Ash Blossom, unlike Maxi, is a card that actually does require you to use it at a more specific instance to negate a specific card effect, whereas Maxi, as we already discussed, generally you can throw out during any kind of phase you feel is applicable. So as a result, Ash Blossom is a bit more tricky to use, and oftentimes does require you to have at least a little bit of knowledge of how your opponent's deck works to identify a good point to Ash Blossom. A lot of times, especially higher skilled players will often try to quote-unquote bait out your Ash Blossom. What I mean by that is that they will use card effects that can get negated by Ash, so they actually want to get hit, because the card they really want to resolve is going to be coming up later in their turn. One of the best examples of this in the current metagame is the Bestial Lubellion. The Bestial Lubellion, with its ability to search any Bestial monster, including Magnum Hut, which can in turn then grab any dragon during the end phase, might seem like a pretty good card to negate with Ash Blossom. However, if you tend to look at the decks that want to play the Bestial Dubellion, they all pretty much have a card effect that they would much rather resolve and not get negated by the Ash Blossom. So most of the time my opponent activates the Bestial Dubellion and I have an Ash Blossom in hand, I'll actually hold it and I'll wait for a better instance to use it. This is just one example, and we will talk about more specific examples as we get to specific deck examples here later in the video. But more often, this knowledge is going to come from time and playing against meta decks and practicing against them quite a bit to know when exactly you're getting kind of baited into using Ash Blossom, or when it's going to be more like, okay, this is a significant effect to negate with the Ash. So Infinite Impermanence is actually much like Ash Blossom. It is a targeted negation against a specific card, so it's important to know the timing of using Infinite Impermanence to maximize its effectiveness. One kind of easy way to identify this against certain decks is seeing if your opponent has a high impact effect that activates on a normal summon. This can often be a great instance of using Infinite Impermanence, because not only do you stop this card that's really, threatening to get these plays going, but this card also required that your opponent use their normal summon, so now they have to continue their plays with the other cards they've opened, and they don't have another normal summon to help them get going, and occasionally this can even be the end of your opponent's turn in the right circumstance. Now, on the other hand, there are some other decks that have a key monster that typically comes out a little bit later that wants to get negated, because if that specific monster is negated, it'll effectively force your opponent to stop their plays, because they just won't be able to find the card that they needed to continue their plays and moving forward from there. This, again, is something we'll talk about in some examples specifically later in the video, but again, also just very much comes from experience. That is actually the #1 tip I can give when it comes to knowing when to throw out Disruption and when to play cards like this is practice, practice, practice. The more comfortable you feel with throwing these cards out against these meta decks, the more you'll be able to quickly evaluate the situation and know when the right time to use them is. This video I very much intend to use as like this video, rather, I am very much intending to be used as a kind of quick reference or a cheat sheet of sorts, right? The rules that we're going to go ahead and talk about here as far as when to activate certain cards aren't like by the books you do this every single time, because there will be instances in which, based on the current board state or what your opponent has, it is actually more important to negate something else. However, I just wanted to give us a good jumping off point to get an idea of when it is important to start negating our opponent's cards, so that we can have a base to build this skill upon. So now that we've covered these kind of general tips for some of the more popular disruptions, let's talk about specific decks and how to utilize these cards against them. Okay, so of course, first and foremost, we are going to be talking about Tearlaments. This is of course now the best deck in this meta and has been for quite a bit of time, and I'm sure a lot of the people who are clicking this video are specifically looking how to counter this deck in particular. Let's start by talking about utilizing Max C. So Max C is actually a card that Tearlaments can play around pretty well. Tearlaments in general do play around Disruption pretty well and have a lot of extenders that help them play past their cards getting negated. It's one of the reasons they're so good in the meta. And if you Max C a Tearlament player, what they're probably going to do is summon the Kick Close and then add Solic to only give you one draw off the Max C, while still setting up not only a monster negate, but the ability to continue their plays by milling 5 cards during your turn. This is fine though, because oftentimes they can go for more than this. So if you use a Max C and your opponent still ends on Kick Close plus Solic, it's just bound to happen, but it's better than what could potentially be happening. If your opponent does start the turn by activating Shyren, that is a great time to activate Max C, because if they're special summoning Shyren right off the bat, they're going to be doing multiple special summons pretty much guaranteed. So in that instance, you will pretty easily gain advantage. Sometimes it can even be right to use Max C on your own turn, especially if they activate Havness. Now, I wouldn't necessarily hold a Max C until your turn. However, if you happen to have a Max C during your turn, your opponent activates Havness's effect, that's a great time to use it, because you'll not only get a draw off the Havness, but if your opponent continues to try and special summon a lot and essentially play during your turn, you're going to get doubly benefited from it, because not only are you drawing all these cards off of Max C, but you're then also able to use them right away, because of course it's your turn. So when it comes to using Ash Blossom against Tearlaments, by far the best cards to negate are the Mill 5 effects from Agido, Kelbeck, and also Kick Close, if possible. The problem is that these effects often do get chain blocked. Kick Close often by the Merly Mill 3, and, you know, the Millers, the Ishizu Millers by whatever cards also got sent to the graveyard. So even though these are by far the best Ash Blossom targets, they're also kind of the hardest effects to actually hit with the Ash Blossom. So if these do end up getting chain blocked, which is often the case, we're looking at some other targets to hit with Ash Blossom. I would not use it against the Pearl Rhino Search. It's just very easy for them to have plays in hand anyway. I don't really like using it against Kick Close's Search either, because yes, it does stop them from adding the Burly, but they still get to activate Kick Close's effect to send it to the graveyard, summon something else more often than not, and then just mill 5 anyway. Using it against Rhinoheart, that's kind of hand dependent sometimes. That's not bad if you don't have any other disruption really. But, you know, again, it's still relatively easy for your opponent to have a follow-up extender. I actually really like using Ash Blossom against Shyren when possible. If you're using it against a Shyren that's activating your opponent's hand, you're actually stopping not just one, but 3 different things from happening. You're stopping the level 4 body from hitting the board, you're stopping a card in hand from being sent to the graveyard, which could be, you know, an Ishizu Miller or a Tearlaments monster, and you're also stopping the mill 3. So that's 3 very significant effects that you're stopping with 1 Ash Blossom negation there. It can also be very good, once again, to use Ash Blossom on your own turn against Havnus. It'll stop your opponent from potentially starting the chain of plays during your turn there. When it comes to infinite impermanence, as we kind of showed in an example earlier, there's one standout card that is by far the best imperm target, and that's going to be Tearlaments Kick Close. If you utilize the imperm against the Kick Close, unlike Ash Blossom, which only negates one of the 2 effects, imperm will actually pretty much stop your opponent from using both, right? You chain it against the search effect, your opponent does not get to add or send a Tearlaments card, and even if your opponent chooses to activate the Kick Close effect to try to send it to the graveyard and mill 5, it'll just be negated. They won't be able to. It can be tempting to use this card on Rhinoheart, and I sometimes see people using the infinite permanence against Rhinoheart, but I would not do that. I would always wait for your opponent to summon Kick Close and then utilize the imperm there. As far as some other options that are good against Tearlaments, there are of course the Bestials, which are all the rage. You can use these to banish a Fuser effect that is activating in the graveyard, and then once you do so, your opponent won't be able to summon a fusion monster because the monster that they're trying to fuse with did end up getting banished there. So in general, effects like that banish are definitely the way to go when it comes to playing against Tearlaments. Do not use cards that send them to the graveyard because you'll just trigger card effects. It's why certain cards like Nibiru, for example, have just not been seeing play in the meta recently, is because, you know, they send the Tearlament cards to the graveyard, trigger the effects anyway, and your big board wipe effectively did nothing. So just to make sure that we are noting to banish specifically our opponent's Tearlament monsters. Alright, talking about Spright here next, we'll start with Maxi. Maxi is actually really effective against Spright because Spright is one of those decks that needs to summon a lot of monsters, multiple monsters, to put up any kind of an end board, right? Unlike Tearlaments, which we talked about before, which can get away with putting out a pretty effective board of disruption and extension on the opponent's turn by only giving the opponent 1 draw off of Maxi, Spright is unable to do that without giving the opponent multiple draws. So I would definitely recommend playing Maxi as soon as possible. If your opponent normal summons a level 2 monster, even if it's just like a Spright Red or something like that, that doesn't have any kind of inherent effect when it's normal summoned, I would still chain Maxi to the resolution of the normal summon, which will require you to keep your toggle on instead of auto. You want to do that because the Spright monsters can special themselves from the hand, and those aren't activated effects. So if Spright Blue or Jet specials themselves from the hand, you don't get to chain Maxi to that. So play Maxi as soon as a level 2 monster hits the board. That way you can start drawing as soon as they start trying to special summon Spright monsters from hand. So for Sprites in particular, I'm actually going to kind of lump Ash Blossom and Infinite Permanence into the same kind of section here, because they actually end up coming up against Sprites at pretty much the exact same moments beat for beat there. And actually, of all the meta decks out there, I think that it's one of the more difficult ones, Spright, to utilize cards like Ash Blossom and Imperm against, mostly because Spright has a lot of search effects and a lot of effects that activate on the field. So it can be a bit confusing to know when to activate them, particularly if your opponent is special summoning Spright Blue or Jet from hand because they already control a level 2 monster. I would actually not use Ash Blossom or Imperm against Blue and Jet most of the time in that situation, because even if you do negate the Blue or Jet, right, your opponent is still going to have multiple level 2 monsters on the board, and they can still just go for plays from there. So I would rather hold Ash Blossom and Imperm against the cards that your opponent's going to make with their multiple level 2 monsters, namely Spright Sprint and Gigantic Spright. It's really good to use Ash or Imperm to negate either of these effects. They both are monster effects that activate on the field and have to do with either sending or summoning from the deck. So they're both cards are both effective against Sprint and Gigantic. So with Sprint, if you negate that effect, you prevent 2 level 2 monsters from hitting the board, and with Gigantic, you stop them from getting whatever part of their engine they don't already have access to. And if Sprint and Gigantic are the only monsters on the board at that point, sometimes it's just the end of your opponent's turn. They just don't get to play anymore after that. So, with Spright, there is always a threat that they just have another Spright monster in hand that they can special summon, but that's always going to be a factor. So we still want to just make sure that we're minimizing the effectiveness of cards like Sprint and Gigantic that allow our opponent to keep digging through their deck and pulling monsters out of their deck. The other fringe thing I'll kind of say is that if your opponent begins the turn by activating Spright Starter, for example, to try to special summon Spright Blue, in that instance, I would use Ash Blossom on the starter, or debatably even sometimes Imperm against the Blue if it's the only monster on the field, because if your opponent is starting off with Spright Starter, there's actually a decent chance that they don't have any other plays in their hand. Typically, Starter is used later in the combo if the opponent did open something like Nimble Beaver or something like that. So if you Ash Blossom the starter, sometimes, again, that's it. They're just done for the turn. Or this is, again, a little bit more debatable because it's so easy for your opponent to just normal summon or special a level 2 monster from hand. But if they begin the turn by using starter for Blue, that's arguably not a terrible use of Imperm either. But again, for Imperm in that instance, I would probably still just wait for the Gigantic or Spread. Alright, as far as other forms of disrupting sprites, Spright actually tends to be more susceptible to board breakers rather than individualized disruption. We already talked about with Ash Blossom and Infinite Permanence why individualized disruption is often not as effective against Spright. It's just because they do so many individual effects all on the same turn that all search, that all summon more cards. So trying to stop one thing like that can be a bit difficult. However, Spright likes to front load its negation on its board, and in that regard, you can utilize board breaker cards like Dark Ruler No More, Evenly or Droplet to negate and or just outright remove all these cards on your opponent's board that are threatening to disrupt you there. And then oftentimes they'll just have not really much anything left in hand either, and it's pretty smooth sailing from there. Okay, next deck we're going to be talking about here is Dragon Link. So, being a long-form combo deck, Maxi is actually very effective against Dragon Link. Just make sure to use it as soon as your opponent summons a level 4 or lower dragon monster. Kind of similar to Spright, you want to do it like as soon as that summon resolves, because they'll often just go into their Link 1 Striker Dragon, and much like specialing the Sprites from hand, you won't have a chance to chain Maxi again until that monster is already summoned. So, just to make sure that we're getting as many draws as we effectively can, make sure that you're doing it as soon as that monster hits the field, or if your opponent starts their play by activating Chaos Space to search the Wyvern Burster or Collapse Serpent, you could even chain Maxi to the resolution of Chaos Space, so that way if your opponent does choose to summon the Wyvern Burster or Collapse Serpent, you'll get that draw there. So when it comes to using Ash Blossom against Dragon Link, it can be a bit tricky because Dragon Link can actually play through Ash Blossom relatively easily, so we want to make sure we're using the negation at a point when it really counts. Again, if their first play of the turn is to start by activating Chaos Space, that's a really good instance to use Ash Blossom because it'll stop them from searching Wyvern Burster or Collapse Serpent, which they often use to start their plays, and also because Chaos Space requires them to discard a card just to activate, that means that they'll be down 2 cards and will have to start their plays with the remaining 3 in hand, which can be a difficult spot for Dragon Link to be in sometimes. So that's a good instance to use Ash Blossom. However, if the opponent doesn't need the Chaos Space and they're just getting their plays going anyway and they're doing like their main combo line, right, I would typically wait. You could debate this very heavily, but I like to wait for the activation of Dragon Ravine. I like Ash Blossoming here because by this point they've already used Striker Dragon, they've already used Wyvern Burster and Collapse Serpent, they've already used Romulus, and now they've already used Dragon Ravine's effect. They've already used all these once per turn effects, and they're so committed to this main combo line that by not getting the Absolouter sent from deck to the graveyard, they're not able to search a Rocket Monster, and very likely are not able to continue their plays. Basically, we kind of force our opponent to have to hold exactly Tracer or Quick Launch at this point to be able to continue this main combo line. So, again, that's kind of debatable, but that's where I like to use Ash Blossom against Dragon Link. So similarly to using Ash Blossom against the Ravine effect, I often like to use the Infinite Permanence against Romulus. It'll stop their main combo line while they're relatively committed to it. Trying to play out of it can be a bit awkward from that stage. So again, I find this to be the stage where I like to use disruptions like Imperm as well. If your opponent is using Rocket Tracer or Chaos Ruler to try to play through a weird hand or possibly another form of disruption you've played earlier during the turn, that can also be a good time to Imperm. But it's kind of situationally dependent. Dragon Link, I will say, is one of the more difficult decks to use cards like Ash Blossom and Imperm against, even if you do know the combo line, just because the deck has a lot of extenders where even if they get disrupted, they can just throw down the extender and just continue their plays anyway. So again, we just want to make sure that these negates are really counting and used against effects that are going to kind of make or break their play there. So again, Dragon Link is a long-form combo deck. As such, Nibiru is actually consistently pretty good against Dragon Link. If you're looking for a card to just completely wipe their board, just make sure you're using it before the Borreload Savage Dragon hits the field, so that way they can't negate it there. Also, the deck's main end board of Borreload Savage Dragon as well as Borrel and a Dragon are prime targets for Super Polymerization that can either summon a Garura, Wings of Restored Life, or Mud Dragon of the Swamp. So that's a particularly good board breaker to utilize against Dragon Link. You can also, of course, utilize Bestial monsters. Even though Dragon Link does utilize Bestials themselves, you can use your Bestials to make sure they're not summoning theirs. Or if your opponent's graveyard does not have a lot of light or dark monsters in it, and you know they have Wyvern Burster or a Collapse Serpent, you can potentially use the Bestials to keep them from summoning those monsters and stop them from making plays as a result. Alright, next up, let's talk about Branded Despia. Max's use against Branded Despia is pretty straightforward. It's not as nuanced as other matchups. I will say that Branded Despia can play around Maxi decently. They have the ability to make Mirror Jade off of as little as 2 special summons. However, that's still fine even if they do that. Like, yes, they do end on the Mirror Jade. However, using the Maxi in that case, if they just go straight for Mirror Jade like that, does stop them from putting out a lot of really scary pieces to their end board. Not just cards on the end board themselves, but cards that would get searched or sent by virtue of doing more special summoning than they do by just, again, directly going straight for the Mirror Jade there. So typically, you know, just use the Maxi against like the Branded Opening or Fusion. Again, it's pretty straightforward. So this is probably the most infamous choke point of the current metagame, but I'll go ahead and talk about this anyway. When playing Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring against Branded Despia, there is exactly one card effect that you want to be negating, and that's going to, of course, be the Branded Fusion. Yeah, don't negate Opening, don't negate Aliber, ignore literally every other card you can Ash Blossom in that matchup. Just save the Ash Blossom for the Branded Fusion. If the Branded Fusion does not resolve, the Despia player is significantly behind. Even if they do end up having follow-up plays, losing access to the Branded Fusion will stop their board from being great and kind of make it just, you know, mid to good. So definitely hold the Ash Blossom for Branded Fusion and pretty much nothing else in this matchup. Alright, Infinite Impermanence actually has a lot more nuance than Ash Blossom when it comes to utilizing it against Branded Despia. There are a couple of different points that you can hit Branded with it, and there are kind of pros and cons to each. Using it against Labrynth does stop the Branded Fusion unless they're already holding it, but even if they are already holding it, it does stop them from adding Branded Lost or another follow-up card like Branded in Red or Branded Banishment. That is definitely a case that you could argue for. I, however, against Branded, typically like to save the Imperm actually for the Fusion Albion the Syrian Dragon, because if you negate this Albion effect, it'll often just stop their play outright. It's kind of similar to stopping the Branded Fusion, except they do still get the, the Albion on board, the 2500 body. But stopping that stops them from summoning Mirror Jade, and because they've already used Branded Fusion at this point, it's often difficult for them to have a follow-up play besides just setting whatever else is relevant in their hand and just passing from there. You could make arguments, pros and cons, for negating either, but again, I slightly prefer the Albion over negating Labrynth, but I don't think negating Labrynth is horribly wrong either. So, like some of the other decks we've seen, Bystials are once again useful here against Branded Despia, particularly for banishing Albaz when specifically Albion's effect is activated. This is good because once the Albaz is banished, they won't be able to make Mirror Jade because Mirror Jade requires Albaz as a target. However, because your opponent has already chosen to activate the effect of Albion, they can't just not fuse. So they'll have to make an non-optimal fusion play, often summoning something like Dragostapelia in an instance where they'll have to use resources they wouldn't really want to be using for just a Dragostapelia. So that's definitely the best point to use the Bystials against Branded Despia, but you could also use Bystials and other graveyard disruption cards against the Albion that gets into their graveyard, because if the Albion is not in the graveyard during the end phase, then your opponent will not get to search for it. Okay, next up we're going to talk about Swordsoul Tenyi. Pretty similar to Branded, Maxi is actually pretty straightforward to use against Swordsoul. Swordsoul telegraphs pretty much all of its summons with activated effects, so you know, you just wait till your opponent normal summons Moye and activates it, or flips up the Ashina in hand and activates it, or especially the Longyan is really good to chain Maxi against because you get 2 draws off it. The Longyan specials itself, that's 1 draw, and the Swordsoul token is a separate draw. They're 2 separate summons, so you do get 2 draws off of it, which is pretty nice. If the Swordsoul player does get hit with a Maxi, they'll typically just make Chi Xiao, search a Blackout, and then pass to give actually still a decent amount of draws there. So, unlike Branded Despia, Ash Blossom is actually really not especially good against Swordsoul Tenyi. The best target for it, in theory, is Chi Xiao. However, this monster is literally always chain blocked by either Moye or Taya's effect, so you're never actually going to get a chance to use Ash Blossom against the best target for it in the deck. As a result, the best target in practice to actually utilize the Ash Blossom against is Swordsoul Emergence. If it's used early in the turn, try to dig for Moye, you can use that to get them to not start their plays to begin with, or if they end up searching it off the Chi Xiao, you can still use it late in the turn to stop them from getting the Protos. The Ashina and Desires that activate towards the beginning of the turn are also pretty good Ash Blossom targets. Basically, against Swordsoul Tenyi, you're just not going to have that many chances to activate Ash, so typically whenever you can activate it is usually not a bad time to. So while Swordsoul isn't particularly weak to Ash Blossom, it is often hit very hard by monster negation. An Imperm used against a normal summoned Moye or Taya often just ends the Swordsoul player's turn right then and there. Additional negations can be used against Chi Xiao or Protos depending on how your opponent follows up after the first disruption. If, for example, you open 2 Imperm and use the first Imperm against Moye, your opponent might still activate Longyan to special it and a token and then sync for Chi Xiao anyway, and then I would just, use the follow-up Imperm there. As far as other disruption against Swordsoul, they do very often summon 5 monsters before they can actually make it to Baron de Fleur. Moye is 1, its Swordsoul token is 2, Chi Xiao is 3, Longyan is 4, and its Swordsoul token is 5. So at that point you can drop a Nibiru on your opponent, and then from there, their board is looking pretty sparse. considering that, you know, they don't have anything left. They'll usually just have the Protoss that they got off Emergence if they even searched it there. So, otherwise, much like Spright, Swordsoul does front load a lot of its disruption onto the board rather than like holding it in the hand or the graveyard. So board breakers that we talked about using against Spright are also particularly effective here as well. Alright, Labrynth is going to be the next deck we're going to cover. Maxi, for being a back row deck, Labrynth is actually surprisingly susceptible to Maxi. You wouldn't think it would be so effective, but it actually is. Even a simple line like your opponent activating Stovey to set the big welcome for a Lady Lab, and then, you know, activating the big welcome to Special Lady Lab, and then Special Stovey, and then Special Lady Lab again. Like, that's already like 3 draws right there off of just the one, you know, again, very simple combo line there. So, again, even though it is a back row based deck, it's often pretty easy to hit them with a Maxi and get multiple draws as a result, which can be very, very helpful for them pushing through that board on your turn. So, kind of similar to Branded Despia, Labrynth has a couple of big flagship cards that get hit especially hard by the Ash Blossom. That's going to be the Welcome Labrynth and the Big Welcome Labrynth. I would generally hold the Ash Blossom for these 2 trap cards rather than use it against something like Ariana or Pot of Extravagance or something like that. Most of the time, especially the big welcome that they search out first or set first to try to start off their plays, if you can negate that, it becomes extremely difficult for the Labrynth player to then mount a comeback, especially because if they use the furniture to set up the big lab and you negate the activation, they won't get the furniture back. So now they're minus a bunch of cards and will have to play with whatever they have left as a result. So, unlike Ash Blossom, I would definitely use Imperm against the Ariana of the Labrynth, mostly because there just aren't a lot of good targets for Imperm in this deck. The furniture cards, they all activate in hand and graveyard, so Imperm just doesn't do anything against them. And the Lady Labrynth is often unable to be targeted. As long as your opponent has literally any set back row card, you won't be able to use Imperm against the Lady Labrynth. There is the Lovely Lab. That's like the only other card pretty much besides Ariana that you can really effectively use Imperm against. And it's definitely good to do so, especially if your opponent is threatening to like pop a card in your hand. I would definitely use the Imperm. Obviously it depends on your hand, but it's often correct to use the Imperm to try to save that card that's in your hand there. So I think this one's fairly obvious as far as like other effective cards you can use against this deck. It pretty much goes without saying that pretty much any form of back row hate is going to be fairly effective against the Labrynth. However, I will say this much. I generally don't like playing these type of cards in the main deck, especially in this particular metagame, because they're just not that good against the majority of other decks, right? Even when Labrynth and the new Trap Tricks also came out, and the decks were all over the ladder, I was still not maining Harpy's Feather Duster and Red Reboot and stuff like that, because I just don't feel like those decks take up enough of the meta to warrant main decking those cards, because those cards are just so bad against the vast majority of decks. So I would much prefer to utilize the more generic disruption we already have at our disposal against Labrynth, because as we've discussed, it is fairly effective against Labrynth. So use what you got. I would not go out of my way to play back row hate against this deck personally. Okay, so the final specific deck that I'm going to talk about here in this video is Floowandereeze. If there are other decks you would like to know my general thoughts of when to disrupt them, you can definitely ask in the comment section below, and I will get to as many of those comments as I can here. But for Floowandereeze, with Maxi, this is kind of one of the bigger draws of playing Floowandereeze in general, is that you are immune to Maxi. This is the only instance where I can really say there's not really any good moment to ever use this card against this deck, because Floowandereeze does not special summon whatsoever. So Maxi is just going to be dead. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, on the other hand, does have some application against Floowandereeze, but it can either be very simple or very tricky when to use the Ash Blossom, depending on what the Floowandereeze hand at players looks like. If your opponent starts by just normal summoning a Rabina and nothing else, then yeah, just toss out Ash Blossom against it. It'll negate it, they won't get the search, they won't get any more normal summons, and they'll just have to pass right then and there. However, if they use map or an Advent of Adventure to try to search a map from the deck, then they have the potential to chain block the Rabina search. If your opponent has a banished Floowandereeze monster and they normal summon Rabina, they can activate Rabina as Chain Link 1, and then the banished flow is Chain Link 2, and then you're no longer able to use the Ash Blossom. For this reason, and also the fact that the Advent does require that your opponent gives up a card in hand just to get the search, I like using Ash Blossom against Advent if that's the first effect they activate. But if not, I would wait for the Rabina. Floowandereeze typically uses a lot of the quote-unquote pot cards, like Pot of Duality, Pot of Extravagance, Pot of Prosperity, and your opponent might start with one of those. But generally speaking, not just against Flow, but generally speaking, decks that play these pot cards have cards that they want to activate later that also search. So I would not use Ash Blossom against like Duality, Extravagance, or Prosperity. You know, if it's against Lab, just wait for the big welcomes. If it's against Flow, just wait for the Advent or Map. If it's like Exosister, just wait for the Martha, so on and so forth. So yeah, just don't use Ash Blossom against any of the pot cards. Wait for Rabina or Advent against Floowandereeze. So Imperm is a lot more straightforward to use against Floowandereeze than Ash Blossom, because unlike Ash Blossom, it can't be chain block. Like Ash, it can halt a play if your opponent simply normal summons Rabina and nothing else. However, if they do have a map, even though you can just Ash Blossom the Rabina, I would still actually wait. If they have the map, they probably have access to even more normal summons, and sometimes stopping the Rabina isn't enough to stop their plays. I would rather use the Imperm in that situation against Eaglin, because Eaglin's going to be what searches M-Pen, and if you Imperm the Eaglin, yes, they'll still have another normal summon, but if they didn't open their M-Pen, which is especially now that that card is at 1, then they're just going to be done with their plays from there. So, again, for the most part, with Flow, it just depends if they have the map or not. If they don't, just negate the Rabina. If they do, it gets a little more nuanced from there. So as far as other disruption against Floowandereeze, particularly if M-Pen does end up hitting the board, it's best to remove it as soon as possible before trying to make your regular plays. This can sometimes mean that you have to summon part of your end board in defense mode to play around the M-Pen's effect, but even if you have to do that, that's still fine, because as long as you can just get rid of the M-Pen, that puts the Floowandereeze player much further behind you. They often kind of live and die by that card, not always by any means. They can also potentially use Dreaming Town to summon Ryza and disrupt you that way, but oftentimes if they don't have the M-Pen on board, they're going to have a much more difficult time stopping your plays. Floowandereeze also does a lot of searching, and as a result, the Duel and Lockbird actually tends to be very, very effective against this deck. However, Duel and Lockbird is a very meta-specific card, and I don't think we're in a metagame where I would main deck Duel and Lockbird. Okay, so there we have it. There I have covered, again, a lot of the more specific top decks of the current metagame, but also some general tips for playing some of the more popular disruption cards. I really hope you all found this information helpful. I definitely, again, see people talking about this topic a lot, so with any luck, you were able to take away something from this video. If you have any other topics you'd like to see me cover here in Master Duel Academy, definitely feel free to let me know in the comments below. This segment, again, is more for like general gameplay tips as opposed to playing one specific deck. So I think that's about all I've got for this lesson. Without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating. that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot, as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now, so without further ado, this is XLex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.